Welcome to the Diversity and Inclusion on Air podcast. This podcast is a program of the Association of American Veterinary Medical Colleges Diversity Matters Initiative. This podcast explores various issues related to diversity and inclusion in the veterinary profession and provides the AAVMC an opportunity to offer ongoing diversity programming to our member institutions as well as all veterinary professionals. My name is Lisa Greenhill, and I'm the Senior Director for Institutional Research and Diversity at AAVMC. So today is a very special episode of Diversity and Inclusion on Air. We are filming live from glorious Naples, Florida, and today's topic is Brexit and veterinary medical education and more broadly, kind of the veterinary profession. So I am joined by some of our wonderful deans from Ireland and the UK, and we're going to talk about what's going on over the ocean there and see what impact that will have on the future of education in the veterinary profession. So as is our practice, we typically allow our guests to introduce themselves. So I am going to pass the mic to my left, and we will also be sliding the camera and mic around today. So roll with us, it'll be fun. So why don't I pass the mic to you first?
Thank you, Lisa. My name is Michael Doherty, and I'm the Dean at the School of Veterinary Medicine, University College Dublin, Ireland.
Good morning, my name is Ewan Cameron, and I'm Head of School at the Vet School at the University of Glasgow in Scotland.
And Stuart Reid, I'm Principal and Executive Dean at the Royal Veterinary College in London, United Kingdom.
Thank you. So our first question is exactly what is Brexit and what was the vote that was taken last summer? So I'm not sure who wants to field this question.
So Brexit was a vote that was taken to consider leaving the European Union. It had come under pressure for a number of years with the rise of a party that pressurised for Britain to leave the European Union. This ultimately culminated in a referendum being held. The referendum was approximately 52% to leave, 48% to remain. But one of the interesting things about how the demographics of the voting broke down was that London chose to remain, Scotland chose to remain, Northern Ireland chose to remain, and parts of England and Wales voted to leave the European Union. Demographics are also quite interesting in terms of how people voted within the United Kingdom, with in general younger people voting to remain in the European Union, and those that had more advanced education generally voting to remain in the European Union, with the remainder of the country voting for out. So it's quite interesting looking at Lisa's headline of diversity and inclusion, because actually the Brexit vote has all been about loss of diversity and exclusion.
So it's interesting when you kind of break down the kind of how people voted and where they voted. It seems to mimic in some ways the US election, where we had big pockets of individuals or communities that were voting either left or right. And it seems that we kind of mirrored that. And some folks have said that we're probably about 6 months behind the UK and some of these kinds of decisions and actions. So my next question is kind of, well, what is the current status? Because I know that there have been some legal rulings. I believe that there was a recent kind of Supreme Court, or whatever the corollary, the Supreme Court ruling kind of, was it blocking or allowing it to go forward? What's the take?
The court decision was all about making the decision to trigger leaving the European Union via vote in Parliament, which I understand took place yesterday, and overwhelmingly in Parliament voted to trigger what's called Article 50, which is the instrument which starts the negotiation with the EU to begin the process of leaving.
So what will happen next? I know that this will probably be a pretty lengthy process. It's never been done before, so I think that it's charting new territory. But in the meantime, are there any implications for education?
Thank you, Lisa. I think there are many implications, some negative, some positive, for education, for veterinary medical education in particular. What happens now is that there's a 2-year period where once it is formally triggered, and that has not yet happened, the Prime Minister, Theresa May, will be doing that sometime, I think, before the end of March. But once that starts, there's then a series of negotiations with the EU to agree the terms under which the UK would leave the EU. And how the world would look thereafter. And that's not a straightforward set of discussions at all. What we would then imagine, if there is no agreement within 2 years, then things become slightly more complicated. But let's just suppose for a moment that we do reach agreement, and there would then be a period of implementation, probably another 2 years. So I think before we see any final and definitive changes, it could be as much as 4 years from now. And the things that are likely to change that would impact on veterinary medical education or education in general relate to the agreements that are currently in place, which relate to the free movement across the EU of goods, services and people. And depending on the arrangements that are reached, everything from the current setting, which allows for free movement of all three, to an arrangement under, let's say, the World Trade Organization rules, where it's a very, very different situation and there's no free movement of anything other than under individual agreements and anything in between those. So, for example, Norway operates under a slightly different set of rules as a member of the European Economic Area, and that allows a certain freedom for some of the commodities and people as we have in the UK currently.
So I got a very quick geography and political and geopolitical lesson when I reached out to Dr. Doherty here. Ireland is not a part of the UK. Close relationship, of course, with the Isles, but how do you see all of this kind of shaking out? And I imagine that there must be some type of ripple effect, maybe.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. Yes, Ireland is a fully committed member of the European Union, and but the story for Ireland is interesting and it's complex. So, on a number of different levels, because the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, will be the only land border that the United Kingdom will have with the European Union. So that's interesting on a whole load of different levels. At a very broad political level, the three of us over a certain generation that we remember a very troubled period on the island of Ireland, and hopefully we'll never go back to that. Prime Minister May visited Dublin on Monday and met with the Irish Taoiseach, Prime Minister Enda Kenny. So at the high political level, there's commitment to working closely together, to recognising the very close relationship that has existed between the UK and Ireland for many, many years, particularly in terms of freedom of travel. But clearly, the political situation around what was called the Good Friday Agreement, or the peace agreement in the north of Ireland, is fundamental, because no one wants to see anything happening there. And so that's the broad political sense, because trade between the two countries is something like 1.2 billion euros a week. And Ireland, particularly the dairy industry in Ireland, depends heavily on export to the United Kingdom. And there's already been an impact there, because sterling has weakened. So Irish dairy exports have really been affected that way, and agriculture has been affected. So ultimately there's a ripple down effect on everything, because that can affect veterinary practice and everything like that. So the big concerns that we would have, because I think my overriding feeling is one of uncertainty, and that's, the Irish word we use is éigeantacht, because we have our own recognised language in the European Union. So, and for instance, I grew up both sides of that border, and there are veterinary practices that operate between Northern Ireland and Ireland, the Republic of Ireland. So clearly, the issues arise, one of the most significant being mutual recognition of qualifications. So at the moment, there's no issue there. But the question is, will the Dublin MVB degree be recognised by the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons in London? Because it will now be an EU degree, and there's a broader role there. So, I'm aware that the Royal College and our competent authority, the Veterinary Council of Ireland, have been in close contact. So one isn't overly worried about this, but the goal should be obviously that there should be absolute mutual recognition of qualifications, because otherwise it would be potentially ludicrous, because we have farmers who travel with animals to veterinary practices in Northern Ireland and vice versa. So there's the movement there. There's the vets who work both sides of the border. There's the medicines that may have different legislation both sides of the border. You see animals move quite a lot like that. You could have a cow going into a veterinary practice from Donegal in the Republic of Ireland to a practice in Northern Ireland, and where does that? So this idea of a hard border, which is the big concern, that there will be customs posts and restrictions, and it's something we all want to try and avoid for those reasons. And so those are some of the really important issues. Animal health itself is critical here, because at the moment Ireland is seen as one epidemiological unit. We're working very closely in Animal Health Ireland with Animal Health and Welfare Northern Ireland. So really there's a common policy in terms of surveillance, diagnostic labs, veterinary practice on the island of Ireland. And anything that would threaten that would be deleterious to animal health and welfare on the island of Ireland. Now, all the veterinarians on the island are committed to making sure that does not happen, but there is some anxiety around it. And interestingly, I think I was talking to our Minister for Agriculture, Martin Blake, this week, and he said that the policy around animal movement in the EU, when it was first formulated, was informed significantly by the Northern Ireland border in terms of free movement. That it had to take cognizance of that. So we'll watch that with interest. Sure. And then the issue of education. There's one vet school on the island of Ireland, and that's UCD Dublin. So we would have 15 to 20 students from Northern Ireland that study in Dublin. So the issue of mutual recognition comes in here, but there's also the issue of funding, because at the moment, the Northern Ireland students who come in on our undergraduate program pay, the EU fee level. So, will that change? Will it affect that? Certainly, talking to colleagues in Belfast recently, there's been some concern about that. So the feeling is one of, we're all working to make sure that we resolve these issues, but there's still some uncertainty, I think, is the best way of summing it up at the moment from an Irish perspective.
Wow, that's a lot. So if we think about this in terms of the 4 years that you kind of mentioned, Dr. Reed, we're talking about roughly a generation of students who would be kind of coming into the profession, more or less. And so as students are thinking about their futures, are you hearing anything amongst your kind of your current students at any of your institutions that this is kind of shaping the way that they think about what their professional futures are going to be, as they thought that they might be able, entering the program, they thought that they would be able to kind of transverse the continent more easily?
So just to put in a little bit of context, universities are all about the free exchange of ideas, people working together. And so if we look at some of the facts and figures, of the residents at the University of Glasgow Veterinary School, 47% of them are European Union nationals, not UK. So they're from other countries of the European Union. In terms of academic staff, 22% of them are from European Union. So actually, in terms of residents, more than 50% of our residents are from somewhere outside the United Kingdom. And that's going to change the dynamics. Already, the universities in the United Kingdom have seen a fall in the number of European Union students who have applied to come to university. Now, the pillars of the EU are about freedom of movement and treating everybody exactly the same. So, in essence, what that means if you're a university student is that you pay the same fees as the home students would pay. So all of that is in doubt. And even the university, in terms of trying to think about its future budgets, don't know how that's going to be handled. And there's a sense that it's not clear yet what the status of people, European Union nationals, will be in the UK in the future in terms of the right to work, the right to stay. That's still in doubt. So there's an awful lot of uncertainty that's already being felt within the university system.
So I wonder if we might partition the discussion, because there are two elements to this. One is around the educational aspects, and that applies to not just to veterinary medical education, but right across the piece. And then the impacts on the profession. We've already heard quite a lot about the the real implications that there are where you've got a common border. I think if you consider for a moment what's happening within the universities, Ewan gave you some figures there. They're pretty much the same for us at the Royal Veterinary College. 28% of our staff are EU nationals. So the uncertainty that Mike spoke about is a really big issue for us all. But that's, again, not unique to us in any size, shape or form. When you consider the things that we do in universities, we educate. So our students come from a variety of sources. I have to say we have relatively few from continental EU come to our college. There are some, but not many. We have far more from outside the EU. And the message there has been that, the UK is open. London is open in our case. I'm sure Glasgow is open, and Edinburgh and Bristol and wherever else are open for business. It's not about constraining. So from wherever you might come. Point one, we research, we discover things, and there the real implication is that the UK pays into a common pot for research funding in the EU under the European Research Council, and we get disproportionately more out of it than we put in. So 20% of the whole spend on research in the EU is won competitively by UK researchers, of whom veterinary researchers are one. Will be excluded from that almost certainly, unless we pay the ticket, and there's some discussion around that. And then there's the issue around clinical services, and I think one of the things that we touched upon there about the composition of our staff, very many of our clinicians, world-leading clinicians, are not UK not UK educated. They've come from a licensed overseas. So the three elements of what we do in veterinary schools will all be impacted. There are plenty of opportunities that come on the back of those. We may look for other sources of research funding elsewhere, but I think we have to be mindful that there will be impacts. And then on the profession side of it, and again, the figures are really very, very similar. The schools in the United Kingdom graduate just under 1,000 graduates a year, but every year there's roughly the same number of veterinary graduates from outside the UK register to practice in the UK. And of those, the overwhelming majority, probably about 80%, are EU nationals. So if they stop coming, we're going to be close on 50% of what we currently need in terms of doing the job. And many of those work in public health and food safety. So there's a really big implication for society if that stops overnight. I'm not suggesting it will stop overnight, but there has to be a consideration. And if you actually look at the number of registrants on the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons register, a little over 50% are UK graduates. The rest are from elsewhere. So it'll have a massive impact on the profession for sure. And that's why under President Tufnell and at the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons and President Rowitz at the British Veterinary Association have both formed task forces to ensure that the profession, both the regulator and the membership organisation, are addressing the issues as they arise.
Wow. So you mentioned, and so each of you have kind of mentioned or alluded to some of maybe the opportunities. What are the opportunities? It sounds like there are a lot of concerns, but are there opportunities, and how are you kind of positioning your institutions to seize those in the face of some of these major concerns? It's like you said there were opportunities.
So before you get the proper answer from my friends here, I think one of the things to remember is currently legislation function under the directive. So it basically defines how it is that we set up our educational programs, what it is we have to teach, and indeed how then to some extent the profession is regulated. I think if that no longer applies, there's a much larger set of discussions that can start to happen. At the moment, we're obliged to recognise graduates from other EU countries, and that comes with advantages and disadvantages. So that mutual recognition of professional qualifications would no longer be binding on the UK. But there are other issues, for example, around limited licensure, perhaps we could start to talk about, or indeed the structure of our veterinary education programs. We have 5 years because, well, historically it's been 5 years, but the EU directive says it has to be a minimum of 5 years. So there are, I think, a range of opportunities that we could start to look at in terms of how we might structure our educational programs and indeed then regulate the profession at large. And with that, I'll hand to Professor Cameron.
I struggle on the advantages at the moment. I think if it's about greater internationalization, then that's one of the potential advantages. But I haven't found that membership of the European Union has particularly restricted that to date. So if it was an extension and a loosening with their ability to interact with the rest of the world, then that could be a potential advantage. But it happens pretty well anyway, so I'm not sure that that's really significant. I think it's fair to say there's many different opinions on the European Union, and one of the criticisms of it was that the system of government was a little bureaucratic and could feel that things take a long time to change and to move forward. One of the interesting areas for veterinary medicine, of course, is that a very strong element of the European Union has been the Common Agricultural Policy, which has essentially been a mechanism to support farming throughout the European Union. And the recognition that there are many parts of Europe where, if it was left entirely to the free market, farming as it exists would not continue, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Now, in the United Kingdom, as a proportion of GDP, farming is much smaller than some other European countries, and therefore has less political lobbying power, less influence. So one of the interesting questions for the large animal side of veterinary medicine is what will happen to farming subsidies, the basic payment that supports farms and supports beef and supports sheep on grazing on rough ground in Scotland. What will happen to those schemes in the long term when we're no longer mandated to have to do them because we're no longer part of the European Union? And I suppose interesting times ahead.
Indeed.
Which in Gaelic means I also find it difficult to be too positive. However, we are, optimistic. I think in some sectors, one reads of business opportunities in terms of relocation of financial companies, banks to Ireland and this kind of thing. But speaking as Dean of a vet school, speaking honestly, I think what I've tried to outline is the uncertainty around it all that we feel. And, I didn't mention the fact that horses move effortlessly from Ireland to England every day to races and racing stables, etc. And, that's a huge sort of thing that's been going on for years and years. Will that be affected? So lots of questions, lots of uncertainty. It's a big ball of wool. However, one remains optimistic that we will just come out of it with excellent relations with the United Kingdom in terms of the professional mutual recognition. I would be very optimistic of that. I think the one positive thing that I would see is that it's forced us to look on the island of Ireland from a veterinary point of view, to work, to build on the work that's been done already around animal health Ireland, animal health welfare Northern Ireland. That it'll force us to do that because we really have to, for the benefit of the animals and the health status of the island, where we're in the process of eradicating bovine viral diarrhea on the island of Ireland. We're working hand in hand with our colleagues in the north. That has to continue. So for animal welfare and animal health. So I think one is optimistic, but it's I can't admit to be singing from the rooftops about it either.
Sure. So with all that's going on, I guess, in the UK and in Ireland, and when you consider what's going on, I guess, in the US, what does recruiting students look like right now for your institutions? Certainly, I know that there are, in my work, I study applicants, and I've been, in the last 2 years in particular, has been interesting because some students or prospective students who are just finishing their application and have applied to some of your institutions have noted, well, when we look at the conversion rates, it's comparable to going to school in the States, out of state, non-resident, and now, with the drop in the pound, it actually is somewhere between going resident and non-resident. So do you see maybe a shift in recruiting more American students, or do you think that those students from those EU countries will continue? And you know that you've said that there was a kind of a bit of a decline in some of those applicants, but do you think that that would rebound, at least in this middle period while things are kind of flux?
I think it's really important to re-emphasize the relatively small number of students that we have coming from continental EU, and I'm looking around and Ewan's nodding here. So the biggest issue is one of perception, and I think that's something that's happening here right now. I mean, there's a reality and there's a perception, and the two aren't necessarily the same thing. In fact, one can be worse or better than the other. Perception at the moment is that for some reason the world is maybe thinking that the UK is closing down. It's becoming more insular and inward looking, and that's, you know, we have to be positive about the changes. They're going to happen, and we've got to make sure that, you know, as leaders, you know, we promise a bigger and better tomorrow, and that's our job, and we simply have to do that. And the opportunities, even on an education level, there are going to be more jobs in the UK for vets that are probably educated within the UK. So for the schools, there's an opportunity for growth potentially. There may be more a greater availability of places for students who want to join the professions. So those are positive aspects. When it comes to recruiting from North America, as COE accredited AAVMC schools, we take our responsibilities here very seriously. We regard ourselves as part of an international family that recognises that people can come from a number of different walks of life and be educated and share community and so on and so forth. And that, perhaps for me, is the biggest message, that the veterinary community is international. It deals with international issues, international trade, international food supply. The infectious diseases don't recognise boundaries, and it doesn't matter what the politicians do. We're going to have to work across those boundaries, and we're going to have to work with people from other nationalities, other nations. So there's actually probably an opportunity to redefine and refocus on how those relationships can work to best advantage, rather than assuming that it is happening at a level, whether it's the continent of Europe or an EU political union or whatever. So I think there are a number of positive things. When it comes to the broader consideration of North America, of course, we have very good relationships, but I notice things are changing here. You know, how student loans will function under new administration, federal loan, who knows? There's that to be considered. And also your schools here and profession here are looking as well at expanding the number of places. There are several new schools have opened in recent years in the US in particular. So part of the game is actually recognizing that change is a constant factor. The only thing that changes is the rate of change.
Right. So this is a really interesting conversation. So what else, I guess, would you want people to know? I mean, I think that the big takeaway message is that the UK is open for business, and that this isn't really kind of a closing. And that is a tough perception, I think, for folks to reconcile, I think. And so because of kind of the global understanding or lack of understanding, frankly, about what the EU is, and what it's supposed to do. So this has never happened before. So it does kind of feel strange, and it does feel kind of isolating for those of us who are not in this system. And so it's really great to hear, and even those opportunities, even if they may be tempered, it's great to hear that there's an opportunity, and that there's still an openness, and that there's a willingness to kind of see what happens next. What other kinds of things would you want folks to know about this kind of period of upheaval in both academic veterinary medicine and as well as the profession in general during this time? I mean, I think that, again, we're still fighting a lot of perceptions.
Very briefly, I think during this period where we appear to be becoming more conservative, and the title of our discussion today is about diversity, equality, and opportunity, and we have to make sure that we don't turn our back on many of the ideals that we pursue. That is a diverse profession that welcomes everybody from wherever they might come, recognizing that the profession is changing dramatically, predominantly now a female profession, and how women's rights within that function appropriately, and looking at the leadership to ensure that those changes do embrace the diverse community that we both serve and should be drawing our members from.
Yeah, and I think it's possible to exaggerate. Certainly we're coming out the political and trade union, which is the EU, but in many ways will be very much part of Europe and continue to interact with many of the institutions that have grown up. So we went into what was the common market, or the EEC, back in 1973. So it's a long time we've been part of Europe. And one of the organisations from the veterinary point of view is EVE, which is an organisation that seeks to improve standards across Europe, and in many ways works to look at standards for accreditation and approval of veterinary schools. Most veterinary schools in Europe are still actually receive their license from the state, but it's an organisation that works together to improve standards, to harmonise standards. And I'm very sure that our relationship with EVE will continue to be very strong. We'll be part of that European family, part of the North American family, and the countries in between the two areas, to continue to look at how we move to working together more successfully, continuing to drive up standards in veterinary education and in veterinary clinical work. And those connections will remain strong. They will continue actually to take place. Certainly, schools are members of EVE, and it's certainly not my intention to leave that organisation.
Yeah, and I would echo what my colleagues here have said in terms of what this is about: diversity and global outreach and welcoming people. Céad Míle Fáilte, that stuff. And the other thing is, I don't think we want to send out a negative message, because sure, it's right that leaders are expected to really put the best foot forward. We offer exceptional student experience in the university and excellence, and we will continue to do that. And within, between Ireland and the UK, we work very closely. Dublin is part of the Veterinary Schools Council, and that will continue. And I think it may well become stronger. So if you're trying to look at the positives, that sometimes in this atmosphere of uncertainty, bonds can strengthen. And that's the message I would like to send out, right, rather than anything negative.
Do any of you have anything else that you want to add to this discussion? I'm sure you can. All right. I think that we have any more questions from me, but I think that that's a great note to end the show on. If you have additional questions for our guests, please do not hesitate to send them to diversitymatters@aavmc.org, and we will make sure that those questions get answered and are embedded into the final cut of the video on YouTube, as well as in the audio version that will be released shortly. So with that, I thank you for joining us for this episode of Diversity and Inclusion on Air. Thank you to our guests. Really, really appreciate you taking some time this morning when we could all be outside in the sun watching the palm trees.
It's raining.
It's not. So with that, we will see you later this month. We have just scheduled our Black History Month episode for Tuesday, February 27th at 5 p.m. Eastern, and that show will feature Dr. Willie Reed, Dean at Purdue, Dr. Ruby Perry, Dean at Tuskegee University, and previous Iverson Award winner, Dr. Paige Carmichael, professor at University of Georgia. So be sure to join us for that episode. With that, we will sign off. Thank you so much and have a great day.